Um, that was The Mannequin Men, which I knew nothing about, but which Corey put me onto, and absolutely terrific band. Corey, I hope, is going to do his research paper on the beginning of the Glastonbury Festival in Britain in the 1970s. So you don't just have to listen to music, you can also think about the history of particular musical forms or of institutions and practices, and I'm hoping that maybe some other people may follow that lead. Last thing by way of introduction is to remind you, and I'm sure your whole day has been building up for it, so it needs no reminding, that the British Ambassador is on campus. Just hold your excitement and your breath. And the talk is this afternoon at 4 o'clock in 223 Moses. I've been asked to drum up at warm bodies who can just sit and nod at appropriate times, so please do come and help me out, because otherwise I'll get into trouble. Okay, so today is a lecture about the discovery of poverty and what the Victorians thought of as the social question. Okay, and in that sense it follows on very nicely from the lecture on Tuesday about the increasing awareness of the systemic failure of the market in a new global context of the 1870s. Now, clearly, it's not that people haven't always been poor. Okay? There's always been poverty. Okay? Nonetheless, poverty only really becomes visible at very specific historical moments. So I'll give you a good example of that in terms of our recent history. After Katrina, there was a sudden awareness of the scale and the depth of poverty in the US, so much so that one of our regents gave a good deal of money to set up a center to study poverty in the US and the world. In a way, one of the most remarkable things about the current recession that we're experiencing is how little concern there is with the poverty and the unemployment that it's producing. Unemployment in the UK is now about 2.5 million. In the US it's about 14 million, that's about 10% of the population, a little under 10% of the population, and yet, until very recently, we've heard very little about that phenomenon. Even if we think back to the first lecture on the riots in the UK, even in that case, there was, for many people, a determination to deny the fact that riots had anything to do with social deprivation and with poverty. Okay, so I'm trying to contrast two moments. That Katrina, okay, where it seems to be the consequence of a natural disaster, you can acknowledge and discover that poverty exists. Okay, in the context of poverty generated by a failure of the financial markets primarily, where there follows massive public disinvestment, it's much harder to acknowledge and to make poverty visible. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that poverty only comes into our focus at very specific moments and in very specific ways. And I want to make the case today that the late Victorian period, from the 1870s onwards especially, was a moment in which Britons became increasingly aware and conscious of the poverty that had always existed around them. Okay? It wasn't that more people suddenly became poor. Okay? It was simply that they became more conscious of that poverty and of the attendant social problems that it generated. The other critical point here is that as they become more aware of the scale and depth of poverty, so they begin increasingly to recognize that that poverty was not a consequence of the failure of a particular individual to support their family, but was a consequence of economic developments that were beyond the control not only of that individual, but increasingly in the context of the 1870s, beyond the control even of a national government. Okay? Very hard to legislate, for instance, for the cotton famine in Britain. Very hard to legislate for what the economic consequences of the American Civil War were. Very hard to legislate for the financial collapse of 1873 in Europe and the US. So, the first point is this increasing awareness of poverty. The second point is the growing recognition that you have to understand poverty in a new type of way. Third point that I want you to get out of this lecture is that in the discovery of poverty, in the investigation of its scale and depth, we have the development, or rather the emergence, of traditions of social scientific research that are still with us today. What I shall be talking about in important measure in this lecture is about the emergence of the social sciences, and perhaps particularly sociology, anthropology, and to a degree history. Now, what these people were, who increasingly saw themselves as scientists studying the social domain, i.e. the social sciences, science is studying the social domain, they made that social domain their object of study because they wanted to understand the sort of rhythms and patterns of social development. In other words, what they wanted to do was discover the laws of social progress, just as political economists had thought that they had discovered the laws of economic progress. Now, of course, once you discover the laws of social progress, then you can make interventions to make society improve. Last point that we're going to cover today is really about the politics of all this. Okay? And I want to emphasize at the beginning that this is a process that emerges internally to liberalism. Okay? Again, it is liberalism struggling, coming to terms with its own paradoxes and contradictions. Liberalism was meant to generate unbound wealth and prosperity and peace. It didn't. It also produced significant and serious poverty. Okay? So the politics that comes out of this is not a repudiation of liberalism and liberal political economy. It's a reconfiguration of it. Okay? And it's a reconfiguration of it in the context, increasingly, of the emergence of socialism as a political force. So the socialism that would ultimately come to displace liberalism, not so much in Britain, but in many other places, took root in these very debates and studies that I'm going to be discussing today. So let's begin by addressing this question of what was the social problem. And Victorians frequently referred to this set of issues as the social problem or the social question. Okay? You can really use either phrase. Now, there are a variety of different perspectives about this social question. Okay? In the first place, there were those who saw the emergence of the market economy and of liberalism more generally as having shattered what had once been a sort of organically coherent community, had shattered the market system, they thought, had shattered the organic bonds of solidarity that had existed before industrialization. And I want to emphasize that the people who held this view existed across the political spectrum. Okay? This was not about occupying a particular political position. So Thomas Carlyle, okay, a fierce critic of liberal political economy, but very much on the right politically, defending the status quo and the old social order. Okay? Friedrich Engels, clearly on the other side of the political fence. Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative politician of the 1870s, very like Carlyle, very fearful of the market mechanisms, very nostalgic for the old social ties and bonds of the pre-industrial era. And lastly, Arnold Toynbee. My last example would be Arnold Toynbee, the Oxford historian, probably the world's first economic historian who wrote a big history of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Big liberal social reformer. Okay? So a liberal who believed that social reforms were necessary to make liberalism work more effectively. Okay, so across the political spectrum, there were those people who had believed that society had once had this organic shape that had now been shattered by the introduction of the cash nexus and the market economy more generally. There were, therefore, those individuals who tried to make society whole again. And you see this very clearly in the examples of the new utopian communities or experimental communities that developed around the industrialist Robert Owen in New Lanarkshire in Scotland, and Titus Salt, who established his own village called Saltaire. Okay? Now these were attempts to try and make industrialism have a socially cohesive form. These were attempts to try and say, no, look, the market economy isn't necessarily destructive, or rather the industrial economy isn't necessarily destructive. What we have to do is to build model communities in which it can be fully incorporated. So this was all about creating model housing for their workers, educational facilities, clean water, clean air, etc., etc. And New Lanark really begins in the early 19th century, in the 1810s, 1820s. Titus Salt is Saltaire, I think, is established in 1850 or 1851. Now, if you like, on the other side of the fence stands our old friend Edwin Chadwick. Okay? Now, Edwin Chadwick does not see society as a type of organic community. Instead, what Chadwick sees, as you know, is a sphere of social action. That is to say that when he thinks of society, he thinks of a range of social problems that have to be addressed in order to make the market and the forward march of civility and progress work more effectively. Okay? And so, as you've seen with the treatment of the New Poor, his work on the New Poor Law and in the sanitary movement, what he did was try and remove the obstacles to social progress. Okay, to try and make specific interventions on specific groups of people to try and remove that social problem as an obstacle to progress. And critically for Chadwick, what that meant was separating out this treatment of social problems from an understanding that they may be rooted in political or economic causes. Okay? That is to say that, as I said before, that the conditions of sanitation that Engels writes about as a product of industrialism, with all that effluent flowing out into people's living conditions and into the cities, and Engels points the finger very